Picture this. The United States Supreme Court is about to drop a bomb that could vaporize $133 billion from the federal treasury, force Donald Trump to personally hand out massive refund checks to over 1,000 companies, including Walmart, Costco, Target, and every major corporation in America, completely destroy the economic foundation of his entire presidency, which he's built on tariff revenue, and potentially bankrupt the United States government because the Treasury only has $774 billion in cash. And Trump has already spent most of it on his crazy programs. And here's the kicker. Trump is losing 93% of the court cases challenging his tariffs in lower courts, which means the Supreme Court is almost certain to rule against him any day now. Oral arguments happened 91 days ago, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett literally asked the government's lawyer, if you lose, tell me how the reimbursement process would work. Would it be a complete mess? And the answer is yes. It would be the biggest financial disaster in American history. And Trump knows it. His Treasury Secretary just admitted refunds would come straight from taxpayers. And you're about to discover how this constitutional crisis is about to explode and why Trump is desperately trying to delay the inevitable catastrophe that could end his presidency. Let me take you back to understand how Donald Trump created the biggest legal and financial mess of his entire presidency. Because to truly grasp the magnitude of what's about to happen, you need to know the full story of Trump's tariff obsession and how it's all about to come crashing down. So let's start at the very beginning when Trump took office for his second term on January 20th, 2025. And one of his very first actions was to declare a national emergency and use that emergency declaration to impose massive tariffs on imports from China, the European Union, Mexico, Canada, and basically every country on Earth. And Trump claimed he had the authority to do this under a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short, which was originally designed to let presidents freeze assets of foreign enemies during genuine national security crises like wars or terrorist attacks. But Trump stretched this law beyond anything it was ever intended for, and used it to impose tariffs on consumer goods, electronics, clothing, food, automobiles, basically everything Americans buy. And he justified this by declaring that America faces economic emergencies related to unfair trade practices. And under Trump's tariff regime, if you wanted to import a smartphone from China, you'd pay a 20% additional tax. If you wanted to import cheese from Europe, you'd pay a tariff. If you wanted to import car parts from Mexico, you'd pay a tariff. And these tariffs added up to hundreds of billions of dollars. And Trump claimed this was making America great again. He said the tariff revenue would pay down the national debt, would fund his warrior dividend bonus for military service members, would help farmers, would create jobs, and would force other countries to respect America. But there was one massive problem with Trump's entire tariff scheme. It was almost certainly illegal because the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to impose taxes and tariffs. Article 1, Section 8 is crystal clear about this. It says, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And for over 200 years, tariffs have been set by Congress through legislation, not by presidents through executive orders. And while Congress has delegated some limited tariff authority to presidents in specific situations, those delegations are supposed to be narrow and temporary. But Trump took that limited authority and expanded it to cover basically all international trade. And legal experts immediately said this violated the Constitution's separation of powers and something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which says that presidents can't make huge policy decisions affecting the entire economy without explicit authorization from Congress. And sure enough, companies started suing almost immediately. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because within months of Trump imposing these tariffs, over 700 companies filed lawsuits in a special court called the Court of International Trade, or CIT, which handles all disputes related to customs and tariffs. And these weren't small mom-and-pop businesses. These were some of the biggest corporations in America, including Learning Resources, which makes educational toys, Lego, Costco, Walmart, Target, Disney, Apple, and hundreds of others. And all of these companies made the same basic argument. Trump's tariffs are unconstitutional because he doesn't have the authority under IEEPA to impose tariffs. IEEPA was meant for freezing freezing assets during emergencies, not for reshaping America's entire trade policy, and the tariffs are causing massive harm to their businesses and to American consumers who are paying higher prices. And here's the crucial part. These companies started winning their cases. The CIT ruled in favor of the companies in case after case after case, finding that Trump had exceeded his authority, that the tariffs were unlawful, and that the companies deserved refunds. And according to legal analysts tracking these cases, Trump's government is losing approximately 93% of the tariff cases in the lower courts, which is an absolutely catastrophic losing record. And two of the most important cases, Learning Resources Inc. vs. Trump and Lego AS vs. Trump, made it all the way to the Federal Appeals Court, and in September 2025, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled unanimously against Trump. The three-judge panel said Trump's use of IEEPA to impose tariffs was unlawful, that the statute doesn't give presidents that kind of broad economic policy-making power, and that the tariffs violated the major questions doctrine, and that ruling created a huge problem for Trump, because if it stood, it would mean that most of his tariffs imposed since January 2025 were illegal, and companies would be entitled to refunds of all the money they had paid, and we're talking about absolutely staggering amounts of money. Trump's tariffs collected approximately $195 billion in fiscal year 2025, and another $62 billion just in the first few months of 2026. So in total, over $250 billion in tariff revenue. And if the courts ruled all of that was illegally collected, the government would have to refund it. But Trump wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. So his lawyers immediately appealed to the Supreme Court and asked the justices to take the case and reverse the lower court rulings. And they also asked the Supreme Court to stay the lower court orders, meaning to put them on hold so Trump could keep collecting tariffs while the case was being decided. And the Supreme Court granted both requests. They agreed to hear the case, and they allowed Trump to keep collecting tariffs pending their decision, which meant billions more dollars kept flowing into the Treasury every single month. And then on November 5th, 2025, exactly 3 months ago, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Learning Resources versus Trump. And what happened during those oral arguments was absolutely devastating for the Trump administration. Because from the very first minutes of oral argument, it was clear that a majority of the justices were deeply skeptical of Trump's position. The government's lawyer stood up and tried to argue that IEEPA gives presidents broad authority to respond to economic emergencies and that tariffs are a legitimate tool for addressing unfair trade practices. But the justices immediately started peppering him with tough questions. Chief Justice John Roberts asked whether there's any limit to what a president could do under the government's interpretation of IEEPA. He said if the president can impose unlimited tariffs on all imports, what's to stop a future president from nationalizing entire industries or seizing private property? And the government's lawyer struggled to answer. Justice Elena Kagan pointed out that IEEPA was passed in 1977 specifically to rein in presidential power after Watergate. It was meant to prevent presidents from abusing emergency powers the way Richard Nixon did. So how can Trump now use that same law to claim essentially unlimited economic authority? And Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who is generally conservative and often sides with presidential power, even he expressed concerns. He asked whether allowing presidents to impose tariffs without congressional approval would eliminate Congress's constitutional role in setting tax policy. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor was even more direct. She said this case presents exactly the kind of major question that requires clear congressional authorization, and IEEPA doesn't provide that authorization. And then came the most damning moment of the entire argument when Justice Amy Coney Barrett turned to Neil Katyal, who was arguing for the companies challenging the tariffs, and she asked him, quote, "If you win, tell me how the reimbursement process would work. Would it be a complete mess?" End quote. And that question revealed that Barrett and probably other justices were already thinking about what happens after they rule against Trump. They were trying to figure out the practical consequences of striking down the tariffs. And Katyal tried to reassure her that there are established procedures for refunding illegally collected tariffs. He pointed to a previous case where the government refunded $730 million in unconstitutional harbor fees. And he said the court could limit its ruling to prospective relief only, meaning the tariffs would be invalidated going forward forward, but past payments wouldn't necessarily be refunded. But Barrett didn't seem convinced, and neither did other justices. And legal experts watching the argument came away convinced that Trump was going to lose, probably by a vote of 6-3, or maybe even 7-2, with Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, Kavanaugh, and Barrett all voting against Trump. And now here we are 91 days after that oral argument, and the Supreme Court still hasn't issued its decision. And every day that goes by, more money piles up in potential refunds. We're now up to about $133 billion according to the most recent estimates, and Trump's team is getting increasingly nervous. His U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer went on CNBC on February 3rd and tried to spin the delay as a good sign. He said, quote, "The Supreme Court is taking its time to rule on a case challenging the legality of President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs given the enormous stakes involved. Large revenues had been collected under the tariffs, and the plaintiffs did not have an open and shut case," end quote. But legal analysts say Greer is blowing smoke. The reality is that Supreme Court decisions in expedited cases like this one typically come out within 60 to 90 days. We're now past 90 days, and the delay probably means the justices are writing multiple opinions, likely a majority opinion striking down the tariffs, concurring opinions from justices who agree with the result but for slightly different reasons, and dissenting opinions from the conservative justices who think Trump should win. And all of that opinion writing takes time, but the decision is coming. Probably within the next few weeks, maybe even this week, and when it drops, all hell is going to break loose. So what happens when the Supreme Court rules against Trump? Well, first, the immediate effect is that Trump loses his authority to impose any new tariffs under IEPA. His entire tariff regime collapses, and he'll have to go back to Congress and ask them to pass legislation authorizing tariffs, which Democrats will never agree to. And even many Republicans are skeptical of tariffs because they raise prices for consumers, so Trump's signature economic policy basically dies. But that's just the beginning, because then comes the question of refunds, and this is where it gets truly catastrophic. If the Supreme Court says the tariffs were unlawful, then legally speaking, the companies that paid those tariffs are entitled to get their money back. It's called a reliquidation process where U.S. Customs and Border Protection goes back through all the import entries and recalculates the duties owed without the illegal IEPA tariffs, and then they issue refunds. And remember, we're talking about $133 billion in potential refunds, and over 1,000 companies have already filed lawsuits specifically asking for their money back. And many more companies will file as soon as the Supreme Court rules. And on January 14th, 2026, the government actually stipulated in court documents that it won't challenge the Court of International Trade's authority to order reliquidation and refunds, which means they've essentially admitted that if they lose at the Supreme Court, the refund process will move forward. They're not going to fight it. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked by Reuters about this, and he said the Treasury has $774 billion on hand, and quote, "It won't be a problem if we have to do the refunds." But here's why that's absolute nonsense. First, that $774 billion isn't just sitting around waiting to be refunded. That money is already allocated to pay for Social Security, Medicare, veteran benefits, military salaries, and every other function of government. If you pull $133 billion out of that account, you're creating a massive hole in the budget. And second, Trump has already spent most of that money on his various programs. He gave away a 1,576 warrior dividend to 1.45 million service members, which cost over $2 billion. He's funding his border wall. He's funding ICE deportations. He's funding all kinds of things. And he was counting on continued tariff revenue to pay for all of this. But if the tariffs are struck down and he has to refund past collections, suddenly there's no revenue coming in. And he owes $133 billion going out. And the only way to cover that is to either cut spending on other programs, which would be politically disastrous, or to borrow more money, which adds to the national debt and makes the deficit worse. And Trump has been bragging about how his tariffs would reduce the deficit, but now they're going to explode it. And Democratic Senator Ron Wyden, who is the ranking member of the Finance Committee, is already preparing legislation to ensure that if refunds are issued, they actually go to the companies that paid the tariffs and not to Trump's cronies or political allies, because there's a real concern that Trump might try to manipulate the refund process. And then there's the question of timing. Trump himself wrote on Truth Social that figuring out the refunds, quote, would take many years to figure out, and it would be a complete mess. and almost impossible for our country to pay. And while he's probably exaggerating to scare people, there is some truth to this. The refund process could take a year or two to fully complete. Companies will have to file claims. The government will have to verify them. There will be disputes and appeals. It's going to be a bureaucratic nightmare. But eventually the money will have to be paid, and the political consequences for Trump are going to be enormous. First, his entire economic message collapses. He's been telling Americans that his tariffs are making America rich and bringing in money to pay for things. But if the Supreme Court says the tariffs were illegal and unconstitutional, then Trump looks like a lawless president who violated the Constitution to impose an illegal tax scheme. And that's impeachable conduct. Democrats will immediately start calling for his impeachment. Second, the refund crisis will dominate the news for months. Every time a major corporation gets a multi-million-dollar refund check, it'll be a story, and it'll remind voters that Trump's policies failed. Third, Trump will have to find new revenue sources to replace the tariff money, which means either raising taxes, which Republicans hate, or cutting spending on popular programs which voters hate, or just letting the deficit explode, which economists hate. There's no good option. And fourth, this ruling will embolden other legal challenges to Trump's use of executive power. If the Supreme Court says he exceeded his authority on tariffs, then courts are more likely to strike down his other executive orders on immigration, on government reorganization, on everything. And Trump's entire presidency could become paralyzed by legal defeats. And perhaps most importantly, this case establishes a major precedent about presidential power and the separation of powers. It sends a clear message that presidents can't bypass Congress and make major policy decisions on their own. They have to work through the legislative process. And that's actually a good thing for democracy, even if it's bad for Trump, because we shouldn't have presidents acting like kings. We should have a system where Congress makes the laws and presidents execute them. And if this ruling helps restore that balance, then it's worth the short-term economic pain. But make no mistake, the pain is going to be significant. Businesses are going to be disrupted while they wait for refunds. Some small companies that paid tariffs might not survive long enough to get their money back. Supply chains will be thrown into chaos as companies adjust to the new tariff environment. And consumers are going to see prices fluctuate wildly as markets respond to the uncertainty. And Trump is going to blame everyone else for this mess. He'll blame the Supreme Court for being political. He'll blame the companies for suing. He'll blame Democrats for celebrating his defeat. He'll blame everyone except himself. But the truth is that this crisis was entirely of Trump's own making. He's the one who decided to push the boundaries of presidential power. He's the one who claimed authority he didn't have. He's the one who ignored warnings from legal experts that his tariff scheme wouldn't survive judicial scrutiny. And now he's going to pay the price. And so is the country. Because whether you support Trump or oppose him, whether you think tariffs are good policy or bad policy, we're all going to suffer the consequences of this constitutional crisis. The economic uncertainty, the fiscal mess, the political chaos. It affects everyone. And that's the real tragedy here, that we have a president who was so obsessed with appearing strong and powerful that he ignored the law and created a disaster that's going to hurt millions of Americans. And the Supreme Court's ruling, whenever it comes, is going to be a historic rebuke of Trump's presidency. And a reminder that in America, no one is above the law, not even the president.